So the last time I saw my dad was my son's first birthday, and I can remember he was quite worried about Joel because Joel was born with talipes, which is clubfoot, and he was quite extreme. He was quite worried about Joel, and I can remember him sharing that with me. And so yeah, we did the birthday party. It was a nice hot day, and I said goodbye to him at the gate, which it's just outside my window now, and I said goodbye to him there. That would have been the last time I ever saw him. And because I think it was probably 2 or 3 days later, I suddenly got a call from my brother John, and he just said, "Dad's gone. He's dead," which was it was so shocking because there was no sign of illness when I'd seen him 2 or 3 days earlier, and he wasn't even ill. He just died in a field with his cows, helping a calf be born, which is absolute poetry for a farmer, because he loved his cows and he didn't want to get old, and he didn't get old, but it was terribly shocking for everybody else. And we just bombed down the motorway to see him, but of course there's nothing you could do. He was already gone. Dad's had a heart attack and he's gone. You know, it's just that. He's just gone. And it was like you didn't expect it. There was no illness, and that was just it. He was gone. There was nothing you could do. You can't argue with death. Yeah. I can't remember much other than the shock. It made me absolutely reel. I think I just walked around the room going, no, just shouting, no, 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 and just, I couldn't take it in. And then my husband at the time drove me down. We went straight down there, and he was laid out in the house in his farming clothes, and he just didn't look like him. It was bizarre, very, very, very bizarre. And Mum, of course, we were very worried about Mum because of the shock, because it was bad enough for us, but Mum had always considered herself half of a whole. And this was so sudden. There was no preparation. Evidently he'd been laughing and joking he was in a field with a nurse friend of his. He'd gone down to see this calving. It was a heifer calf, and they knew the calf was going to be a bit large calf, so he went down to make sure that she was okay. And he went down with his nurse friend to this field, and Mum was just driving down with some coffee for them because the evening was drawing in, and he'd been laughing and joking, having a wonderful time prior to that. And as the car headlights, he was picked out in the car headlights, she saw him. He just pulled the calf off, and she saw him clutch his heart, and he looked at her, so she was the last thing he would have seen. And he clutched at his chest, and he fell over, and he was gone. It was that quick. It was seconds. Massive heart attack. But yeah, Mum, I'm not sure Mum ever recovered really, did she? She sort of sat in a chair for the next, 25 years? I can remember when she had her stroke. That was shocking because, again, it's like, it's so bizarre when somebody has a stroke because you don't recognise them and they can't communicate, and their emotions are really, really raw. And I thought it'd be really useful to take in a photo of Dad, so she remembered who she was, because you couldn't reach her. She couldn't speak. She didn't look like Mum or anything. So but we took this photo in, and she took one look at it, and she just howled. It was gut wrenching. And so I tried to take the photo away because I thought it was upsetting her. But no, she wanted to remember who she'd been. One of the things I can remember, going back a long, long way to Four Winds, when I left Four Winds when I was 4, so I would have been younger than 4. But I can remember I was very deaf at the time. I used to have a lot of problems with my hearing, and it made me very deaf. But Mum used to sing all the time, and it used to act funnily. Joel does the same. When he's really happy, you know he's happy because he sings all the time. And because I was a little bit deaf, I was quite vulnerable and a bit weird, but because we also had this very religious upbringing, we were always being told that at any point in time all the Christian people would be suddenly taken. If I didn't hear my mum singing, I would think that she'd suddenly disappeared and left me. One of the things we used to have to do is people who would, it's this horrible atmosphere, because I can remember the atmosphere of these rooms, is as people were dying, Angela and I used to have to go around and we'd have to sing to these people, these elderly people who we didn't know, who were obviously dying. But what was so strange is when Mum was dying, and she took a long time to die, you probably remember, and you're not sure whether they can hear you or not. From what I understand, hearing is the last thing to go. And in that last night, Ange and I actually were sleeping on the floor in the hospital by her bed, which you weren't supposed to really, but that's where we were. And you couldn't sleep because it was just too awful. And she'd got some hymn books, so we started singing. And how old are we now? We're both in our 60s. But we remembered back to being 10 and 12, and honestly, we remembered every harmony. It was extraordinary. We remembered it all. And so we sang through the night. Partly because we didn't know what else to do. We thought it might be a comfort to her, because she probably could hear us. But it was also the fact that that's what all those years ago we'd done, but as children we didn't realise what we were doing or why we were doing, but as adults we realised that that was a comfort to people who are in their last hours, really. But yeah, when you think about it, it's a very odd, morbid thing to make children to do, but we survived. He used to work a lot, so I don't have many memories. But we used to go riding on Dartmoor, and though when we first went riding, I wasn't too happy about it, because I was riding with my friends and I wanted to go out and do an activity outside of school. So we used to go riding, and it was fantastic because, you know, it was so matey and girly, and riding across Dartmoor was fantastic. Then my dad, bless him, in his wisdom, bought me a horse, which sounds fantastic, but in the context of the fact that I was really enjoying my friend's company, it wasn't. But I now see, as an older person, I now understand it was his way of doing something with me, which I appreciate now. Perhaps I didn't appreciate it then. And every Saturday we would go saddle up the horses and go riding across Dartmoor, and that was my main link with Dad, I think. He was quite, you know, of that era, 1950s and 60s, men didn't have a lot to do with their children, so that was quite a special thing. What else do I remember? I remember him singing, and I remember him playing the accordion and the piano. But because he did work very hard, those were the times when we'd see him. Oh, I know what else we used to do. On Sunday we used to go walking on the moors. And so that was very important to him, that as a family we all went walking on the moors after a big Sunday lunch. And then of course there was an awful lot of church going at the time. So I think 3 times we'd go on a Sunday. But that's probably my main memories of him, to be honest. And as a farm, oh, actually, I do have another memory now. Very bizarre memory, actually, if you think about it. But one of the things I had to do before I went to school was, when the new calves were born, I would go and draw their markings in order to register them. It's like my first little job, really. And in those early mornings, I would draw these calves, and sometimes I would help with the carvings and the newlyborns. And Dad would show me how you had to get the calves to feed as they were born. You had to get them feeding straight away, because this little window when they were very alert. And he would show me all these things with the births and everything. And it's so strange that when I had my children, this is very odd, the things that I remembered when I gave birth to my children were actually those lessons that my dad taught me in his sort of animal husbandry. It's really, really strange, but all those things came back really strongly. How you had to feed your baby quickly, and how they were very alert when they were just born. All those things came back, and that was just very bizarre that he should have had such influence on that stage of my life rather than my mother. It was my father who had influence. But those little times before I went to school were really special because, as I say, in that era, girls didn't tend to spend a lot of time with their dads. Loved plays on words. He used to repeat the same joke over and over and laugh a lot to himself. He did love to laugh. He did love to sing. He was very strict. He's very principled. Without you absolutely knew he was totally honest. Totally honest. There was no doubt about that. But very, very strict. I know he had a good education. He went to Wellington School, but he wasn't a questioning man. He didn't think things through particularly, but that might well have been the era, because that was the era when it was the war and people didn't question things. You just did what you were told. So that was the era he came from. So I can't tell how much of how he was the era he was brought up in, or how much was he himself. He was a very handsome man. He didn't realise. He just didn't realise. And he would have, even just before he died, he was in his 60s, his early 60s, and he would still have women swooning over him, and he didn't even notice. It was part of his charm. And it wasn't so much the way he looked, it's just the way he was. It's hard for me to, this is what my mum's told me, hard for me to judge. I was his daughter. But he just had this presence about him, a gentleman. So yes, he had his talents. He had his musical talents. He loved his farming. He liked nice things. I mean, it was bizarre, really, because he had peacocks on the farm. That's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, that's odd, isn't it? Peacocks. Cool. It's quirky though, and he could talk to them as well. Yeah. He could call them, yeah, and they'd answer. Oh yeah, and I can remember going to Painton Zoo with him and him calling the peacocks and them answering him, much to my embarrassment. He was very naive. Oh, I must have told you about the story. Did I tell you about the story of when we went to yeah, when we went to Carnaby Street? How old would I have been? Not very old, probably 16, 17. Something like that. But we went to Carnaby Street, and he went in with my mother, who's very prim. You know, she had her little hat and her gloves and her heels, and Dad, as innocent as anything, went into Carnaby Street and bought a whip. He bought a whip and then walked round Carnaby Street with his whip hanging onto Mum's hand, and it was so embarrassing. We were walking several paces behind, and he didn't get it. He had absolutely no idea why that was so funny or shocking. He just had no idea. And I mean, this is the couple who call their dog Randy. I mean, that was another. Who but my parents would call it? They were so innocent. They were really innocent. They call their dog Randy, so you had to go out and, yeah. Oh, bless. So he's a strange mixture of this farmer. There's obviously a good upbringing there. This naivety, this humour. He was very kind and very strict. And you would have loved him.